Hello, my name is Anna Price. I am a victim advocate and have been for almost 4 years with Deaf Unity. Deaf Unity is an organization for the deaf based in Wisconsin. We are a statewide organization, and we serve deaf victims who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and are victims of crime. And I'm involved in SART because I want to ensure that deaf victims' voices are heard and that we have equal access. Certainly. As a survivor myself, I know that it's imperative that individuals believe my story and that I don't feel ignored or distrusted, that you don't feel small as a survivor. I don't want other deaf victims or survivors to feel small. I want to give back to my community so that deaf victims and survivors feel valued, that they feel that their voice is important and that it's heard. Oftentimes deaf individuals throughout their lifetime, whether it's in their family or in the community, their identity has been taken away. They've been robbed of that identity. And so where and how we can support those deaf victims and survivors to be themselves and to heal, that's where we want to make a difference in their life. And believe them, let them know that they're embraced and that their story is valuable. Certainly. So currently within our SART team, I represent and speak on behalf of the deaf community and deaf victims. The members of the SART team are able to hear our story, identify challenges within our community. Of course, we keep everything confidential and don't include names, but I think that hearing from scenarios from deaf victims would be very beneficial. Simply hearing from me doesn't have as great of an impact. Currently, we do not invite deaf survivors and do not have any deaf survivors in the SART meetings. I would love in the future to have a deaf survivor attend meetings, and I think that would be imperative for them to share their story in their words. It would be very powerful to have the SART team hear directly from a survivor who is deaf. The barriers that they experience with law enforcement, for example, how that can be improved. That individual could share barriers in mainstream programs, how that could be improved. The deaf survivor could share what they would like to have improved in the community. I think that would be more powerful than me simply sharing as an advocate, because I'm not sharing my stories, I'm often sharing their stories. So I think the impact is greater, and I would love to see that in the future. I think ways that can be accomplished to protect confidentiality as well as lessening the triggering effect. I think if a deaf survivor attended a SART meeting, it could be potentially triggering, potentially re-traumatizing to see a prosecutor, attorney, to see a sane nurse, to see law enforcement in attendance. I think ideas on how to minimize that re-triggering effect could be to create a video blog or vlog to videotape the deaf victim telling their story, the deaf survivor sharing their experience, and to bring that video and to allow the SART team to watch it and then discuss how we could improve services for the deaf community, and allow that survivor to tell their own story, to protect them from being re-traumatized, to protect their confidentiality, to protect them from being re-triggered. Have them videotape their story outside of the SART meeting and then bring that video to the SART meeting. And I think that that's one way that we could improve the deaf survivor's experience and to minimize the impact of sexual violence in our community, and to also accelerate the healing of deaf survivors going forward. Certainly, I would say SART's responsibility in responding to sexual violence in the deaf community is to understand deaf culture and build a good relationship and rapport with Deaf Unity or other deaf advocacy programs throughout the nation. I believe that that is vital. The allyship in building trust with those types of communities, building that rapport is essential. Certainly alone, one individual is not able to make a difference in the entire community. Working with SART, they're excellent resources. It's vital to collaborate with deaf advocates. So the advice that I would give to SART members is looking at deaf victims as a whole, not looking at a deaf victim as disabled. So considering them as a whole person. They have a different walk of life. They have different baggage. There could be multiple layers of negative emotions or angers. Look past that. Look at the individual as a whole, an individual who wants help, who wants to improve their life, who wants to heal. So I would say communicate in simple terms, use simple language to ensure that communication is achieved. Show compassion. A deaf victim may be anxious and unable to communicate clearly. They may be scared. They may look to a SART member as someone who is unable to communicate with them, and then they will shut down and their behavior will change. So I think it's important to show compassion and to put your best face forward and work with them and say, hey, the deaf community advocate is on the way, or here's information that we have from the deaf program, a deaf brochure, here's the contact information that we have. Ensure that you have a good relationship with an interpreting agency to get qualified interpreters. Ensure that the interpreter who is coming, that someone can be there, be on site, be available. And as we wait for the deaf advocate to arrive on site and the interpreter to arrive on site, try your best to communicate and make sure that their needs are met. Get them a drink of water, ask and use gestures, to ask if, hey, do you want a blanket? Those gestures are easily understood by deaf individuals, and perhaps they want to rest. So writing back and forth in English using very simple language can ensure that that deaf person is comfortable and looking at them as a whole person. So when looking at the community of individuals who are able to hear versus the deaf community, and individuals who are deaf, we learn about sexual violence in a different manner. And so individuals who are able to hear throughout their life are exposed to information about sexual violence from their family, friends, the education system. They learn about what sexual violence is. Whereas individuals who are deaf don't necessarily have access to that information and aren't able to learn about that throughout their lifetime. And so they may think that that is normal. And because of their educational background and perhaps lack of language and literacy, they aren't able to learn about sexual violence throughout their lifetime. And so when they experience sexual violence, there are many barriers that exist. And examples of barriers are language access, understanding of the different types of sexual violence, that it's not just one type of sexual violence, rape, for example, but there are many types of sexual violence that exist. Interacting with law enforcement or various programs. Service providers for the mainstream community often are not accessible to deaf individuals because interpreters aren't provided. So oftentimes deaf individuals are marginalized and are a vulnerable group. Perpetrators who are able to hear often victimize deaf individuals because of those reasons, and their deaf individuals' voices are marginalized. Perpetrators who are able to hear often take advantage of their identity and will perhaps interpret situations or twist stories as they're talking to law enforcement or speak on behalf of the deaf victim to create additional barriers for deaf victims. Currently, we have a church preacher involved. We also have a clergy member as well as individuals from the faith community. That's what we're seeing currently. Because they have seen so much sexual violence within their faith communities, that spiritual abuse, they wanted to involve themselves in SART to lessen that violence that they're seeing within their community. So we have embraced that. It improves our community's safety. For example, those individuals who are perpetrators in those spiritual environments, churches, etc., clergy members who are involved want to ensure that their faith communities are safe. And so if a pastor is an abuser themselves and the community is maybe not trusting that individual or not trusting their wife or partner or children, and not believing them, it's imperative that we ensure that the faith community is safe, and it benefits us and our entire community to have those individuals involved to learn the aspects and the type of violence that's happening in those faith communities, and to do safety planning and to ensure that those victims' voices are heard, to ensure that we have the resources available to benefit that particular community. So within our SART team, we do not use names of individuals. We discuss scenarios, but we never incorporate names. So we may use hypothetical names or gender, just simply gender. So those non-traditional or non-core members would not be able to pinpoint an individual, but would be able to understand the scenario and be involved in helping or coming up with ideas and ways to help the victim. So we would use that scenario throughout the entire meeting. That would come up frequently. For example, if a prosecutor or district attorney is at a meeting, how would that individual, as an attorney, support the victim? How would I, as a community advocate, support the victim? So hypothetically, you could say, this victim is deaf. You may even change the story a bit. And then we would get the sane nurse response or law enforcement's response to that same scenario. So we come up with hypotheticals to protect the privacy of the individuals who are actually involved in those scenarios. While building rapport with law enforcement is valuable, it is imperative to recognize that deaf victims and survivors are not all the same. Deaf victims and survivors have various backgrounds, various identities. A deaf individual may not use sign language, may have an oral approach to using language, may be a lesbian, living in poverty, not college educated. In their lived experience, they have multiple levels of oppression. And so they certainly come with different baggage and a different approach to working with law enforcement. How will they be able to work with law enforcement? How will they be able to make that connection? And I'm very interested in working to improve that relationship. In working with individuals who are deaf, African American, perhaps highly educated, that individual is going to have a different approach to working with law enforcement. Law enforcement may have an already established stereotype about that individual who's African American. And so as a deaf advocate, we need to educate the law enforcement officers to peel away the layers of oppression and be sensitive to looking to that individual as a whole person. Because within our community, trusting law enforcement is not easy. They have experienced multiple layers of oppression, and it's important to understand the multiple layers of identity that exist for individuals within our community. Challenges include many things, but number one is access to language and the use of interpreters. Oftentimes, law enforcement approach a deaf victim and realize that they need an interpreter and ask if they can read lips, ask if they're able to write in English. And I'm here to tell you that the fact is that deaf individuals are only able to understand 30% of what is spoken. So lip reading is only 30% effective. In addition, on top of that, this individual has experienced trauma. And the mental state of a deaf survivor is not necessarily in a place to understand lip reading, and they're in crisis. It makes it even harder to read lips. So that 30% is even less. Communication is vital. And as a deaf individual, if I am stressed, if I am in crisis, reading lips is impossible. It's an impossible task. I'm not even able to think clearly. And writing in English, if a deaf survivor does not have English competency or English literacy skills, they're not going to be able to understand what's written in English, and they will simply attempt to write in ASL grammatical structure, which is not similar to English grammatical structure. So what a deaf individual writes and may not be clear to a law enforcement officer and may not make sense to them, and the law enforcement officer may think that the person is unintelligent. Oftentimes, their facial expression will illustrate that they're not believing the deaf individual. The deaf individual may get the idea that law enforcement is not believing them or thinking that they're not intelligent, and it completely shuts down the communication process. And so that challenge exists, and oftentimes law enforcement will then identify the deaf person as angry or as not being willing to cooperate. And I have, as a deaf advocate, seen this happen many times, seen deaf victims be frustrated, their anger that ensues, and I understand where they're coming from as a deaf person. And so my job as a community advocate is to educate law enforcement and ensure that an interpreter is made available. I am not an interpreter as a deaf advocate. Many times law enforcement think, oh, I'm an interpreter and I can I'm an advocate and I can also work as an interpreter. That's not the case. And I'm certainly not speaking on their behalf. I am empowering the deaf victim to tell their story, and they deserve equal access in terms of getting an interpreter so that their story can be heard. It's a big issue that we face in the community, and it's another reason why deaf victims often don't call 911 for help, because they're afraid of either being hung up on or not being heard. Oftentimes, deaf victims call 911 and they will go through video relay service to place the call. So that looks, they need to connect with 911 through an interpreter. And so when they make that call, and if the victim's female and the interpreter on the line is male, the law enforcement, or the 911 operator will hear a male voice and be confused about who's speaking. If a deaf survivor is saying, I'm a female, but they're hearing a male voice, it often gets misunderstood, and the message conveyed is not understood, and so 911 operators may think it's a prank call or may simply hang up. And that has happened within our community, and story after story that has happened. 911 operators simply hang up on deaf survivors because of the relay service component, and they think that an individual is speaking for someone else and don't necessarily understand how the relay system works with our current technology. The good news is that our organization, Deaf Unity, in Wisconsin, currently we are working with local 911 call centers to educate them on the use of video relay service and how the operators can speak with deaf victims through 911 and through video relay service. So asking the victims to, oftentimes the questions that they're asked are triggering or traumatizing, and on occasion 911 operators will ask a battery of questions and the victim will become overwhelmed and not have patience and simply hang up on their end. So at Deaf Unity, our advocacy organization is trying to educate both the 911 operators as well as the deaf victims so that they can call 911 and with confidence, that they can feel safe reaching out to 911, and that the 911 operators are working from a trauma-informed lens. That's the goal. Unfortunately, the deaf population is hidden in some regards. Deaf victims in programs and mainstream shelters, hospitals for sexual violence or sexual assault is definitely a small percentage and a small number. And so it is easy to marginalize and ignore that community. They don't often come out to ask for help and receive resources and assert that they need support, because often the victim survivors are afraid and will assume that the mainstream community doesn't understand their needs. And so how to stop that and how to ensure that those deaf victim survivors are not ignored. In a perfect world, if all programs and all community members and resources were trained and understood the aspects of deaf culture and were culturally competent and ready to work with deaf survivors, ensuring that their programs were accessible for deaf individuals, that would be the perfect world. Unfortunately, that's not the world we exist in, and that it does take time. Down the road, I hope that programs and individuals will identify and be able to work with deaf individuals. If we as SART stand up and say these individuals need to be served as well as other communities and other states, and we spread that word and ensure that the programs are able to work with deaf individuals and address those barriers and challenges that deaf survivors face, I think we have to plant those seeds and work our way there. I feel very strongly about working with law enforcement and the legal system. I believe that that is the root of the problem often in how deaf victims are not heard, how deaf victims are further marginalized systemically within the criminal justice system. I deeply value working on the root cause and not jumping ahead to solving other problems. Problems certainly do exist and will continue to exist further down the line, but I believe that it's imperative to look at the root and the lack of understanding within the criminal justice system and within law enforcement of deaf individuals in the deaf community. I think working with law enforcement, they are the first responders. They are first on scene. Deaf victims trust law enforcement, and they, as we know, pass case information to attorneys who then bring it to court. So that train starts with law enforcement, and we want to work with law enforcement. And I'm very passionate about building rapport with law enforcement so they're able to better understand the deaf community and feel confident and ready to serve the deaf community and deaf victims specifically. To that end, in training, we love interactive training. So any way that we can ensure that it's interactive. Deaf individuals love to incorporate visual activities, scenarios, and practice. What would we do? Role playing, allowing officers to see our perspective and to be engaged, not simply presenting information in a lecture format. That doesn't have as great of an impact. We want to ensure that the information we're sharing has an impact, and we do that in an interactive manner. So when our organization provides trainings for law enforcement, our future goal is to record those trainings so that law enforcement is able to see and then share with their staff members. This field of advocacy and law enforcement and the criminal justice system, there's a high rate of turnover, as we know. And so how do we ensure that new staff members coming on board have the same understanding of the deaf community and deaf culture? We've provided a training, but it's the responsibility of the law enforcement to pass that information along to new staff, whether that's through staff meetings, and that it becomes an ongoing discussion, not just a one-time training, so that the word deaf isn't new to them. We want the word deaf not to be scary to law enforcement officers. We want them to understand our community and work with us. So that is my place of passion, starting with the root cause and seeing that improve our rapport with law enforcement, I believe will have an effect on improving our work with prosecutors, district attorneys, as well as the criminal justice system and courts. In looking to the future for SART, I think there are numerous components within the deaf community that need to be addressed. Again, looking at deaf individuals as a whole person, being culturally sensitive, being aware of resources that you can connect a deaf individual to. For example, building a rapport or relationship with an interpreting agency, so interpreters are available when needed. Advocating with a deaf advocacy organization, being trained and connecting with that culturally specific organization. Building rapport with the deaf program. Also, our organization, as Deaf Unity, we produce brochures, pamphlets, materials that are available, and we are happy to distribute those to programs and staff at those programs to ensure that their programs are deaf-friendly and accessible to deaf individuals, ensuring that a deaf survivor has a seat at the table, that the deaf individual can travel and share their story, that their experience can be widely known, and that the challenges and barriers that they faced, that the tips that they have to share with the SART team is able to be shared, and so that relationship is built. With all of those components, I believe that SART would be providing valuable services to our community, and that the deaf community would feel recognized and empowered, recognized that we're here and that we're not invisible.